What's up? Today I'd like to share with you a very simple and effective opening against the Sicilian defense, and you can use this even against stronger opponents with good results. So first of all, let me just explain why so many people asked me about this video. It's because many players love playing this first move pawn e4 because it gives you a lot of great attacking options. For example, if black responds symmetrically pawn e5. There are many variations here where you can have a strong attacking setup, and I've got a number of videos about that. But the main challenge with the move pawn e4 is that if black responds pawn c5 going into the Sicilian defense, then things get a lot more complicated. Because if you go after that into the main line, knight f3, let's say there is pawn d4, you go pawn d4, going into the main line of the Sicilian defense, then here, after knight f6, knight c3, black has a number of options here. They can go pawn a6, going into the Najdorf variation, very popular, played by Fischer, Kasparov, and many other great players, and it's a very complicated variation by itself. They also have g6, the dragon variation, also a very complex line with so much theory out there, and some other options as well, e6, Scheveningen, and some other stuff. And, learning all these opening lines and variations is very difficult. So that's why a lot of students ask me, like, Igor, is there anything simpler that I can use against Sicilian defense if I don't have that much time to study all this complicated theory? And that simple and effective variation does exist, and that's what I'm about to share with you today. The trick is that when someone plays the Sicilian defense against you and you go knight f3, they play pawn d6, instead of pushing the central pawn forward, which opens up for the main lines, you play bishop b5. Over here, bishop b5 check, known as the Moscow variation. And yes, despite of political situation, it's fine to play Moscow variation in chess. So here, after bishop b5 check, usually your opponent will cover their king, you trade bishops, they recapture with the queen, because they want to leave this c6 square for their knight to be developed there later on. And now you play the first key move, pawn c4, which is a multi-purpose move. It gives you a very strong control over the central squares. Secondly, it puts your pawns on the right color, because you've got the dark squared bishop over here. So you want to keep your pawns on the light squares. And when you move your d-pawn forward, either to d3 or d4, your bishop will have a lot of open space here to move. Now, that's the opposite to the opponent's bishop, because they have got the dark squared bishop, but all of these pawns on the dark squares are definitely restricting the activity of that bishop, and therefore, for black, it's going to be much harder to find, an active position for the bishop in the future. So these are just some general ideas about this opening, but anyway, understanding that makes it easier for you to play. Now, black will play probably knight c6, you play symmetrically knight c3, black will usually go g6, because again, the bishop is quite passive along this diagonal, therefore they want to fianchetto it so that it has some potential there in the future. Now you play pawn d4 so that you grab this control over the central squares, and since the pawn is ready to be pushed forward and attack black, they will need to trade. You recapture with the knight, they usually go bishop g7, which double attacks the knight over here in the center of the board, that's why it needs to be supported, and you play bishop e3. The great advantage of this system is that it's very, very simple. You're going to be playing the same moves, the same setup all the time, regardless of black's moves. Now, they go knight f6 here, which is the move which you got to pay attention to, because it looks like black just develops a knight, preparing to castle on the next move. But in fact, it also holds an attacking idea, which is knight to g4. And if they play that move, you actually run into a lot of trouble here, because let's say you just castle and overlook that idea. Then whenever black goes knight g4, as you can see, this bishop here is attacked by the knight, and the bishop cannot go away because it needs to support this knight in the center of the board, which is also attacked multiple times. So you're running quite a big trouble here. That's why definitely you got to be aware of this. Black has a lot of tricks in the Sicilian defense, generally speaking. Got to be aware of them. By the way, I've got another video of 5 best opening traps in the Sicilian defense. It got over 1 million views already, so definitely check this out if you haven't seen this already, with more common tactics and tricks in the Sicilian defense. But right now in this position, you've got a very simple solution. You play pawn f3, which is a part of your setup anyway. And in this case, it blocks the knight from going there. It also supports the central pawn e4 just in case, so that you can never blunder it, black can never capture it. So it solidifies your position, and now your central position is rock solid. You have nothing to worry about. Black will probably castle, you castle as well. And if they go here, let's say rook to c8, that's another moment where you got to be careful, because that's another move which looks like they're just bringing the rook into play, but in fact there is an x-ray to this pawn, and black potentially considers exchanging the knights, and after that the rook can win the pawn in the center of the board. So you definitely got to be careful about that, and you just need to defend the pawn by playing pawn b3. And now pay attention to this setup, because that's what you're aiming for. You've got this beautiful pawn structure in the center, kind of the crab variation, you know, with the crab hands, you kind of hold black, and there is nothing black can do really. It's a very annoying position for black to be into, because just think about this. Let me remove those colors. What can black really do? How can black go forward and attack you anyhow? Let's look at this knight. Where can it go? Here? No, it's attacked. Here, it's defended. Here, it's already attacked by the pawn. It can only go to h5, but it doesn't do anything there, right? So the knight can now really go. The bishop on g7 is also restricted by the knight, right? So the bishop does nothing. Now, how can the queen go forward? Let's take a look. Here, it's already controlled by the pawn. Here, controlled by the pawn. Here, controlled by the pawn. Here, controlled by the knight. It can't go anywhere. So the rooks are also restricted, standing there on the last rank. The pawn cannot go here, it's attacked by the white's pawn. What else can black really do? This pawn, I mean, can possibly go forward, but it's a very bad positional mistake, because in this position, this pawn on d6 will become a permanent backward pawn weakness. This d5 hole will be a great square for your pieces in the future. Therefore, even though black can possibly move their e-pawn forward like this, but it's going to be a very bad positional mistake, weakening their position a lot. All in all, if you look at this position once again, black is completely restricted, and it's very hard for black to come up with any meaningful plan of what is it that they're going to do later on in the game. And that's why I said that you can play this against stronger opponents, because stronger opponents will typically try to push for a win, right? They'll try to attack you. But in this position, they don't really have any opportunity for that. And if they ever try, it can very easily backfire, just because, you know, there isn't any solid opportunity that they can really execute. Now, if they play pawn a6, that's another standard plan for black here, which they will try against you, but you just gotta be prepared. The a6 pawn potentially prepares this b5 advancement, and you can and should stop it. Because if you don't, let me just show you. If, let's say, you play some generic move, rook to c1, what black plans here is to trade the knights here in the center of the board, and then the queen starts supporting this b5 square, and they can start undermining your center by playing b5. As we discussed earlier, these central pawns of yours, kind of like the crab hands, holding your position, holding your opponent's position rather, and so you want to keep that. You don't want to allow your opponent to trade them off and get more space for their maneuvers. So even though, of course, the position still remains to be very good for you, but there is no reason for you to give this chance for black. So going back a few moves, whenever your opponent goes pawn a6, you gotta watch over this potential b5 advancement, and you just need to stop this. The best way to do this is to play queen d3, so that you solidify your position and your queen also starts to provide more control over that square, and black can never push their pawn to b5 and can never free up their position. Okay, what's gonna happen next? Let's say they bring their other rook into play, you go rook c1, usually on the next move you'll also play rook d1 to bring all of your pieces into play, and now black has a quite unpleasant choice of what to do. They can just sit there and wait, which is not a very, promising strategy overall. If they go knight e5, attacking your queen by the way, you just move it down, nothing really happens, nothing changed, so that doesn't achieve anything for black. If they try pawn e6, trying to break through in the center of the board, that plan does not really work, but they'll still try it because, for lack of other options, they'll try that one. You play rook d1, and now if they try e5, and they very often will, this in fact backfires, because you've got such a strong control over these central squares that playing d5 rather helps you to attack, not your opponent. But still, you gotta know how to react. So the great way is to trade here, and then you take on c6, very, very good thing to do. Now black will probably need to recapture by the pawn, because otherwise you can win this pawn on d5 in the future. So they'll probably capture with a pawn to support this pawn in the center of the board. And here is the key thing. Even though you could take here, that's not the best thing, because it allows black's pieces to get some activity. Much better option is to push your pawn forward to e5, kicking this knight away. And that's the reason why you wanted to eliminate the black's knight, the queenside knight there. So if you remember, there was the queenside knight there which controlled this square. But now for lack of the knight, you can easily push the pawn forward, attack the knight. It doesn't have any good squares to go to. It would have to go back, all the way back to e8, to a completely passive position. And now you just get a completely dominant position. The best move to play would be knight a4, aiming for knight b6 with a double attack to the queen and rook, even though potentially the knight can also be brought to c5, which is also a very good attacking square. And overall, if you just look at this position overall, your knight can go to one of these squares and attack a lot on the black's position. Your queen can always capture that pawn on a6. Your rook is also putting pressure along the semi-open file to this pawn. You can always play pawn f4 just to solidify your central pawn, which restricts this bishop because it doesn't have anything to do. Also, the black's knight on e8 is completely passive. So overall, you can see that you've got a completely dominant position and a lot of pawn weaknesses that you can easily attack. So that's how you initially get just super rock solid position in the center of the board, and you get some dominance there. And if your opponent ever tries to push forward, very often it only exposes some new weaknesses in their position that you can easily collect later. And here is the puzzle of the day. Not just a puzzle, but a very useful one. It is white to move, and you've got to find the beneficial tactics for white here. It's a common tactical motif, and that's why definitely it's great if you can find it, so that you can also use it in this opening when you play this. Now, you may watch the other video that I mentioned previously with the 5 best opening traps in the Sicilian defense by clicking the link over there, or you may wish to attend my free masterclass by clicking there and bring your chess to the next level. Either way, wishing you all the best in your chess battles. Talk soon. Ciao.